gives me great pleasure to introduce today's book talk by Ali Kassem on behalf of my colleagues in the Beirut Urban Lab. My name is Mona Harb, for those who don't know me online. Not sure how many you are, but I suspect that we have a larger group at this time of the semester. This is our before last book talk of this season, of this academic year. And before I introduce Dr. Ali Kassem and the colleagues, I just want to say a few words about Ali. I met Ali in 2017 while I was looking for a research assistant to help me in a research project with Watfa Najdi, who was an MUPP student in the program. And he was highly recommended by Professor Sari Hanafi, who should have been here today. I saw him in the ACSS conference, and he was very sad that he wasn't going to be there. And I don't know if he managed to sign online, but he will certainly see this later. I owe him connecting me with Ali. It's been, I would say, a great series of exchange since then that I hold very dear. We co-authored the paper on Syrian entrepreneurs in Beirut, so you can check that out from a previous life Ali had. He doesn't work on this in his work, but it was an interesting conversation. I also was his mentor at the Beirut Urban Lab as an ACSS fellow, and it was also during difficult times in Beirut, but we still managed to have very productive and rich exchanges. I am very happy and very proud to host him today to discuss his book entitled Islamophobia and Lebanon, Visibly Muslim Women and Global Coloniality, published recently with Tauris. You can peek at the cover on the table here, and he will tell you much more about it shortly. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce him right now, and after his presentation, he will be discussed by three discussants, Ghina Abi-Ghannam, Nada Moumtaz, and Zina Sawaf, whom I'll introduce later. They're here, so they made it. They're all here, and they made it, so we thank them for their presence. Let me say a few words about Ali's profile before giving him the floor. So currently, Ali Kassem is a lecturer in sociology at the National University of Singapore, in Singapore. He was previously, as I mentioned, a postdoc research fellow at the Arab Council for Social Sciences and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and he was affiliated at the Beirut Urban Lab of the American University of Beirut. He was also a postdoc fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies and the Walid Center at the University of Edinburgh, where he also taught at the School of Social and Political Science there. He has a lot of research and teaching experience. He had positions at the Finnish Institute for Middle East Studies, at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, at AUB, at the Lebanese American University, and the University of Brighton, among others. Ali Kassem has a PhD in sociology from the University of Sussex in the UK, where he taught as well between 2018 and 2021. And I think that concludes his biography. Without further ado, I will give him the floor. He has a short presentation about his book. Tfaddal, Ali. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Mona. That was a very generous introduction. I mean, I want to first thank the Beirut Urban Lab, which has been a really interesting intellectual hub that I've engaged with at multiple occasions. But I particularly want to thank Mona because she's intellectually inspiring, but she's also incredibly generous interpersonally, and she's been a source of support and source of mentorship that any early career, any person actually can only hope to have. So yeah, Mona's actually one of the most formative figures in my intellectual, but also my personal development and thinking, so which I really appreciate. And she's had a huge imprint on this book, but also on my wider work in many ways, which we can talk about later. But to make to make use of time, I want to leave space for discussion, and particularly I'm really looking forward to hearing from three really wonderful discussants, and I'm really very, very grateful for them to take the time, particularly, at the end of semester. It's a very sensitive time of year for people who teach and who are in academia. So I really appreciate that. But I want to overview what the book is trying to do, what I tried to do in the book, and where I see it going, hopefully to open up the space for the conversation. The easiest way to do this, so the first book launch I had was at Edinburgh, and I was supposed to talk for 15 minutes, and I ended up going on and on for like 40. So to avoid that happening, I'm just going to overview the book's outline to say what it does and how it's structured, and then very quickly say what its main contributions are, or what it's trying to make as main contributions. The book's introduction starts by setting out the field of Islamophobia studies, and to say that usually and standardly Islamophobia is studied within Euro-American contexts primarily, and the framing presents it as a phenomenon that belongs to the quote-unquote so-called West. Then the book makes the statement that, well, what if we try to think of whether Islamophobia exists outside of such contexts, and what would that mean? What would it allow us to do? And then it tries to make an argument that the literature on Islamophobia studies has also theoretically come from very specific vantage points and very specific genealogies of thought. And what if we do it differently? The introduction also sets out the case. It also sets out the methods and a reflection on my positionality. As you'll see, the book's participants are visibly Muslim women. I am not a visibly Muslim woman, and henceforth there's a significant part of the introduction that tries to think through what does it mean for me to be doing that project. And I do want to say here that, so this book is based on my PhD. My PhD did not start as a study of Islamophobia, nor as a study of or with visibly Muslim women. It started as a project that was interested in exploring Islamic political presence and visibility and activism in Lebanon and its relationship to the post-colonial Lebanese state. So how does Islamic political activism articulate itself as Islamic, and how does it articulate its identity in relation to the Lebanese state? And then when I started doing fieldwork, and my first 2 or 3 interviews so happened to be with 3 women activists, they were very explicitly saying, what do you mean political activism? We don't, this is not very relevant. What do you mean identity, citizenship, belonging? We're not getting what you're trying to do, but we will tell you what is important, and it's the discrimination that we experience. And so I did a few more interviews, and then I ended up pausing the project. I went back to Brighton, rewrote the entire project to become a project on Islamophobia, narrowed it down to the experiences of women for a number of reasons, and then from there, I get to this. Okay, so what the second chapter tries to do, or the first kind of non-introduction chapter, I guess, is to historicize and frame both Lebanon and Muslim dress. So it's basically an argument to understand Lebanon from a particular vantage point, and to say, if I understand Lebanon as a post-colonial state, as a state that continues to be a post-colonial state, what does that mean if I take the colonial seriously? But also Muslim dress, it overviews some of the literature, some of the relevant scholarship on Muslim dress, and tries to identify some of the key gaps that the book contributes to. The third chapter is the first empirical chapter, and in that chapter, I make the argument that the experiences of discriminations that participants that structure their lived experience are a form of racialization. I do that by drawing specifically on Latin American theories of racialization, particularly the work of Ramon Gross-Fouquet and Nelson Maldonado Tauris, to conceptualize race and racism as a structure of humanization and dehumanization, and as a social hierarchy that consequently implies particular forms of rights and privileges, or the denial of those rights and privileges. And I try to think of that racialization at the intersection of the local and the global. So it's really an attempt to say, well, if it is a form of racialization, how does that racialization map across both local articulations but also global factors? So in a sense, it's at that tension between trying to analyze its phenomenon within its particularities and context, but at the same time to move away from any kind of exceptionalizing narrative or any narrative that wants to reduce it into a particular thing. And I start with that by analyzing the way that visibly Muslim women are exposed from full citizenry, i.e. how they do not conform to the ideal imagined Lebanese Muslim women within mainstream Lebanese society from their own experiences and their own standpoints, to arrive at how they are exposed from full humanity, and how their very humanity, i.e. their very legitimacy of being, is put into question as a result of their perceived Muslimness. In the fourth chapter, I then say, okay, if this is a form of racialization, how does it pan out? How does it happen? How is it experienced at the level of lived experience in the everyday? So I start by looking at the domestic sphere, then the public sphere, then the work, and then state spheres. And there's a very specific kind of compartmentalization that happens there, which I also try to kind of work against. But analytically, I found it useful to say, or to identify different mechanisms of expulsion, of racialization, of dehumanization, of discrimination, of things as varied going from microaggressions to structural forms of discrimination across these different spheres. And here I try to make comparisons to anti-Muslim racism within Euro-American contexts, and to say, okay, this is how it's lived within a Muslim majority space, this is how it's lived within an Arab majority space, this is how it's lived elsewhere. How does that speak to the literature? How does that allow us to understand how it's lived in Euro-America differently as well? Chapter 5 maps the kaleidoscopic spectrum of Muslim dress and the reproduction of anti-Muslim racism. So that chapter starts to take seriously the idea that, well, there's no one kind of Islamic visibility, there's no one kind of Muslim presence, and Muslim dress itself is a spectrum. It's differentiated. There are many different kinds of Muslim dress, and the lived experiences are structured by that kind of visibility. And I try to analyze what does that mean, and the argument that I make there is that the way through which that differentiation takes place is part and parcel of the reproduction of the wider structures of Islamophobia in the country. Then chapter 6 moves to think of the forms of resistance or refusal or negotiation, what I kind of end up kind of not knowing what to call, so just call difa', which was the word they were using, as defa'an. So I try to analyze the discourses as well as the practices that participants enact in order to make an argument or to establish the legitimacy of their Muslim dress. And by doing that, I make an argument that much of their difa' itself also reproduces coloniality. That they, in claiming the legitimacy of their dress, they function from within the epistemic structures of a very particular civilizational model and of a very particular set of assumptions and a very particular set of understandings of who is a legitimate modern subject. And by doing that, they're not only they're reproducing the wider structures of modernity coloniality rather than only Islamophobia. And then the conclusion tries to pull some of these together to make an argument on what does it mean to think Islamophobia elsewhere and otherwise, but also what does that mean, particularly in a time of intersectional inequalities and multiple crises, and to say and to open up questions that the book I think raises but leaves unanswered. So through that, I try to put forth a number of arguments and to contribute to a number of bodies of literature and scholarship. One of them is Islamophobia studies. And a part of my argument is that there's a huge, huge blind spot in Islamophobia studies. It doesn't study Islamophobia that is internalized, and it does not study Islamophobia within Muslim communities, and it does not study Islamophobia as it is lived as a socio-psychological mechanism in a way. In the sense of Islamophobia is premised on an othering, on an idea that there's another and the other is hated because they're not known or not understood. And hence, to combat Islamophobia, you can teach people, you can educate them. If they know more Muslims, then the bigotry will subside. And a whole range of even policy and practical assumptions that shape recommendations that are being put forth in universities and in institutions across the world. The argument that the book makes is that, well, I think it's a stretch to say that Muslims don't know Muslims or that they don't know themselves. And hence, if we take seriously the fact that Islamophobia is prevalent as an internalized mechanism, then what does that do to those assumptions? But also to think of wider ethnic and racial studies, particularly to enter into the conversation around ethnic and racial studies from the standpoint of decolonial thought and what decolonial thought has been trying to articulate, and to say that thinking coloniality is not only relevant for Latin American contexts or European contexts. It's a global phenomenon with particularities, of course, but it is a global phenomenon. And ethnic and racial studies has a lot to learn from the contribution of anti-colonial and decolonial thinking. The second set of bodies of scholarship that the book tries to contribute to is Middle East studies. One, to say that, well, there's Islamophobia in the so-called Middle East or in West Asia. Why is that not? So when we speak of intersectional injustices, when we speak of forms of inequality and of forms of discrimination, that doesn't really come to mind a lot. And I kind of allude to that towards the conclusion of the book. I don't explore it in depth. I was hoping to. I'm not going to do that anymore. I can say why in a minute. But the book does kind of say that this is not a Lebanese phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that happens in Lebanon. It has particularities as it unfolds in Lebanon. It exists, the very structure of the Lebanese society, of the Lebanese state, of the Lebanese imaginary, its history, the legacies of the past that continue to structure the present are, of course, huge in that. But I do not think this is a particularly Lebanese phenomenon. And in conversations with colleagues who have done fieldwork in places as varied as Egypt, which I set forth in the conclusion, Egypt, I don't think I talk about Iraq in the conclusion because I think that happened later, but Iraq, pre-war Syria, many parts of the Arab world, similar mechanisms unfold. They're not the same, of course they're not, and they're not, they have different mechanisms, even at the sense of how they function, but there's something similar, and the phenomenon exists in one way or another, and that opens up questions about how we study and understand the region. It also makes a number of other arguments about de-exceptionalizing the Middle East and de-exceptionalizing Lebanon and how we understand these spaces, to think of how the social phenomenon and the forms of inequality and injustice that exist within them exist at the intersection of the local and the global, and that these are very much shaped by global Eurocentric modernity. But also, and maybe for me, the most kind of central contribution I wanted to make was to decolonial thought. And decolonial thought, particularly to Latin American decolonial thought, which in many ways has marginalized the Arab world. So there's a particular assumption that the Arab world is a space out of which post-colonial thinking emerges, not decolonial thinking. And there's a resistance, even amongst decolonial scholars and even amongst some of, I've been in conversation with the biggest names in decolonial work, and some of them were hesitant, some of them were outright kind of, this is a Latin American thing, and which I agree, it is. And I think there are particularities to the Latin American context, and I don't think, theory doesn't travel easily, and I don't think it travels well, but I think there are parts of it or components of it that can be generative to think alongside and understanding the region. Now, I should say that had I been writing this today, I would have probably scaled that back a bit. So I am writing something else now in which I'm actually making the argument that we shouldn't be using decolonial thought to understand the region. But that was kind of where it was at the time. And I do see value in it, and I do see kind of generative potential in it, but I also see serious limitations as well. But also to think across traditions of anti and post and decolonial thinking, and also to say, what does it mean to be doing anti and post and decolonial theory by thinking alongside people and their lived experiences in the everyday, rather than doing it in the abstract, which unfortunately a lot of contemporary articulations of decolonial thinking have been doing. Okay, to wrap this up, what is this book trying to do, or the so what of the book in a way, is really to make a connection between Islamophobia and coloniality. So the book is about Lebanon, but it's not really about Lebanon. And it is thinking alongside Visibly Muslim Women, but it's not really about Visibly Muslim Women. It's actually about Islamophobia, in a way, maybe. But what it's really about is coloniality as a global phenomenon. It's really about Eurocentric modernity, for me at least. And I think there are three moments in the book's argument. The first moment is to say that Islamophobia is structured and shaped by coloniality, that we cannot understand Islamophobia as a form of prejudice or as a form of ignorance or as a form of something that gets localized in a particular space or as a form of political contestation or political competition, as something that happens because of 9/11 or as something that happens because of a particular geopolitical struggle. The argument is not to dismiss those and not to say that those don't exist, but to say that analytically we need to censor coloniality to make sense of it and to understand it. And also, I mean, one of the things that the book tries to do in that sense is to say that these experiences that my participants shared are not because of sectarianism, right? And you know, I'm leaving this to the end because usually I think a lot of people would analyze those experiences as a form of sectarianism. They would be, yeah, of course, because it's a sectarian country, so this ends up happening. My argument is that no, that's not the case. That doesn't mean sectarianism doesn't exist or that it doesn't shape this or that it doesn't entangle with this. Of course it does, but it does mean that that it cannot be reduced to sectarianism. Surely the experiences that participants have with their parents or with their friends or with other Muslims or with themselves are not sectarian experiences. But I would argue even experiences they have with people from other sects are not sectarian experiences. That doesn't mean, again, that there's no sectarian component or dimension. There is, but that is something, and reducing it to that is something else. So the first moment in the book's arguments is to say that Islamophobia is structured and shaped by coloniality. The second moment of the book's argument is to say that Islamophobia reproduces coloniality. That Islamophobia is not only something that erases or aggresses or produces particular kinds of lived experiences, but rather that it is something that is part and parcel of coloniality's mechanisms of reproduction and establishment. How in its establishment, but also in its resistance, coloniality ends up being reproduced. The last moment in the book's argument, which is very much linked to the argument that Islamophobia reproduces coloniality, and which I sort of develop more in the final chapter and maybe in the conclusion, but which, if I were doing this now, I would have developed, more explicitly, I think, and which I'm hoping to develop more explicitly, is that Islamophobia forecloses possibilities towards alternative Islams. So what I'm trying to say here is that by establishing itself and by establishing the parameters of how it can be resisted or how it can be contested or negotiated or refused, Islamophobia traps the quote-unquote Muslim subject within a particular modernist epistemic frame that makes it impossible to resist or to negotiate or to refuse from outside that epistemic frame. Consequently, a particular kind of modernist Islam gets produced. And by doing so, and what I mean by modernist Islam ranges from a particular understanding of the self and the subject to a particular understanding of legitimate knowledge and a particular understanding of science and logic to particular kinds of possible futures and impossible futures. So the argument that what I hope the book does ultimately is to say that if we think that the present, extant, contemporary, mainstream standard form of Islam is non-liberatory or anti-liberatory, and if we're invested in developing or imagining alternative forms of Islam, and by alternative forms of Islam, I mean anti-capitalist, anti-anthropocentric, feminist, queer, a whole range of things, then we need to take Islamophobia seriously as something that prevents the possibility of generating alternative forms of Islam, and as something that forecloses those alternative forms of Islam. And that, ranging from how so I'll just give one example and close. Within fieldwork, there was an insistence on articulating an Islam that is, quote unquote, logical as opposed to mysticist, or as opposed to Sufi, or as opposed to irrational, or as opposed to a whole bunch of things, which automatically in the field was erasing a plethora of multitude pluriversal Islams that have long existed. And my argument is that, as an example, is that the dangers of Islamophobia, for me, not to negate, of course, I mean, there's a this is a material lived experience, and I do not want to negate that. But the larger dangers of Islamophobia for me are what they foreclose and what they make impossible in terms of liberatory futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us. It's a pleasure to host you. Okay, if you want me to start with Zina, then number 2. تكرم عينك. Nada بتمون لأنه she's been in this space for 3 times, so she has a clear advantage on the rest. Okay, we'll do it that way. Let me start by introducing Dr. Zina Sawaf, who's an assistant professor of interdisciplinary gender studies at the Lebanese American University. She's a social anthropologist who has written and published on ethnographic practice in the Arab region, on divorce and the state in Saudi Arabia, and the history of anthropology in Lebanon. Her book project, entitled Encountering the State, Women and Intimate Lives in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, is based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork in the Arabian Peninsula and is a study of embodied encounters between women and the processes, offices, and officials of the state, as well as its material culture. We're very much waiting to see the book and host a book talk about it as well. Dr. Nada Moumtaz, for those who don't know her, is an associate professor in the Department of for the Study of Religion and the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilization at the University of Toronto. She received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and her research interests center on capitalism, Islam, charity, the urban, law, and span the 19th and 21st century in the Levant. Her book, God's Property, Islam, Charity, and the Modern State, which was presented in this room a few weeks ago. You can check the video actually on the Facebook page of the Beirut Urban Lab if you missed it, examines the contemporary Islamic revival of waqfs in Beirut to shed new light on the secularization of religion through the lens of its separation from the economy. She's embarking on a new project to examine practices of elderly care among Sunni Muslims in Beirut. Ghina Abi-Ghannam, is a PhD candidate in critical social psychology at the Graduate Center, also from the City University of New York. She holds an MA in psychology with emphasis on social and political psychology from the American University of Beirut. Her research includes the study of resistance, decolonial violence, and the political psychology of social movements in the Global South. Thank you again for being with us and engaging with Ali's book. And we look forward very much to your insights. We will start with Dr. Zina Sawaf, please.
Thank you. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have read Ali's book. So thank you. So in this brief note, I would like to discuss how Ali Kassem's Islamophobia and Lebanon contributes to feminist and decolonizing research from the Global South, and contributes to gender studies in the region. So you forgot that it's a contribution to gender studies. I would also like to pose a few questions about Ali's positionality and the voices he chooses to include and thereby not include in this very powerful and poignant account of anti-Muslim racism in Lebanon. Ali's book is first and foremost a feminist endeavor, in my opinion, that emphasizes the intersectional, gendered, and racialized oppressions that visibly Muslim women in Lebanon face. And he grounds these oppressions in their lived experiences, emotions, and embodiments. His book is a necessary narrative of the global prevalence of Islamophobia through the case study of anti-Muslim racism in Lebanon. I have to emphasize that it is a feminist inquiry that is grounded in and uses women's experiences, and specifically the lived experiences of hijab-wearing visibly Muslim women, as empirical and theoretical resources. It demonstrates the extent to which Islamophobia in Lebanon is not only gendered, felt very deeply and painfully by women, but it is also racialized. Hijab wearing women figure as racialized and inferiorized others located at the very bottom of the hierarchy of the human. In other words, visibly Muslim women's oppression in Lebanon is intersectional and interlocking. It is both gendered and racialized. So this resounds or echoes with black women's experiences in the US as being both women and black, which are the roots of gender studies. On the one hand, so we have to see this in light, and Ali brings this up several times in the book, that in contrast, men's dress or head covering were never an issue. They were a non-starter. Local forms of men's dress and hair covering in Lebanon disappeared. They were, and Iran and Turkey, everywhere in the wider Middle East, they disappeared. And they were Europeanized and westernized without making a stir or causing controversy or public debate or decisions. In some parts of the region, they still exist, right, in the Gulf. But again, there's no issue there. So that's the gendered part of this oppression. Now, as for the racialized part of this oppression, women's hijab acts like a racial marker. So it's like a mark of race, because it physically and visibly associates women with Islam, a religion that, according to Ali, is the lowest religion on the hierarchy today under globalized modernity. So by being immediately identifiable and identified as Muslim, women automatically belong to an Arabo-Muslim difference and a clear set of traits. These are listed by Ali: uncivilized, oppressed, dirty, unclean, smelling, stupid, unlawful, monolingual, lacking education, illiterate, monolithic, barbaric, and backward. So they come to be associated with these traits and with a religion that is on the lowest rank of the hierarchy. So the intersection of these gendered and racialized identities within a system and a structure that is Islamophobic creates deeply wounding effects among hijabi women. And he very movingly and poignantly describes these wounding effects. And he very successfully shows us how women then begin to dilute, or the veil begins to be diluted and emptied out to no longer resemble itself. Okay, and in turn, women are left with just trying to be more fashionable, or in the context of Lebanon, more modern, or to have the most luxurious or most let's say fashionable, expensive, stylish, attractive hijab. They are compelled to pursue distinction and modernity in the context of Lebanon. And even as they try to be the most fashionable and the most modernized, wearing colorful hijab with tight clothing or so on and so forth, as the hijab becomes more and more diluted and emptied out and mummified, as Ali tells us, the visibly Muslim woman is never equal but only allowed to climb this hierarchy. Sorry, turning the page. I felt at pains reading this book. I felt for these women, and I also felt guilty of some of the biases that we have towards visibly Muslim women. Even Muslim as I am myself, I felt that I do hold visibly Muslim women up to different standards than I hold myself, or I hold expectations of them that I wouldn't necessarily hold of myself. So this book really enlightened me in the sense that I now feel the struggles of visibly Muslim women in Lebanon. I feel their wounding, as you term it. Okay, I also somehow feel guilty of this internalized or inflicted racism. Okay. Okay, but moving on, I do have some questions. You really successfully delineate and draw and trace this internalized racism, okay? And hijabi women, they face this internalized women among their friends, among their immediate circles, in their families, in the street, in their places of work, and everywhere. I was wondering why you didn't give more space to institutionalized racism. So you use the voices of women to show us how they are, quote unquote, oppressed, and how they face these myriad interlocking oppressions: inferiorization, colonization, racism, patriarchy. Okay, so you use their voices to tell us how they face these oppressions, but you don't use their voices to make space. You don't use their voices to show us how they resist those oppressions. Not so much. You have a couple of pages in the last chapter, at the very end of the last chapter. Why? And why not make room for institutionalized racism? Why not talk to the actual racists, the institutions that are racist? There are plenty, right? We know them. We know the big ones, like ABC, Middle East Airlines. Those are just the ones that I know. And I'm sure there are plenty of others, hosts of others. I mean, if you had given voice to the actual racists, perhaps you could have used the voices of women more to speak to their agency and the many ways in which they inhabit this borderland you call of coloniality and modernity. So you shed light on visibly Muslim women's subordination and oppression, but you could have balancing that out with more fleshed out accounts of their agency would have been welcome, because their lived experiences are not just about inferiorization and subordination, right? And I'm also curious as to how they opened up to you, Ali, given that your positionality as a man who has never had to struggle with your sartorial appearance, at least not in its relation to religion, right? I don't know if you have to deal with other issues of what you wear and your head covering. Because, so I'm curious as to how they opened up to you, because the interviews are indeed very thick, and they really reveal women's most profound relationships with themselves. So how did all of that unfold? So those are really my questions. One is just about how the interviews went, how did they unfold, and why not use the voices of the actual racists and make more positive or constructive use of the voices of women to show really how they, deal with this wounding, with the wounding effects.
Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this and for the chance to read your book, Ali. I want to start by congratulating you on writing this really important book. It's a book that needed to be written. I think Zina does a great job of explaining that, and it sheds light on the lived experiences and discourses of many hijab-wearing women in Lebanon as they recount them. And I would say that the stories, I'm going to now address you as Kassem because that's, the official kind of line. The stories that Kassem tells resonated with stories I've heard many times from hijab-wearing women in my life. From assuming that the Hajj cannot read or write, to being prohibited from going to a beach just because of the hijab. What someone who does not have such lived experiences might cast as exceptions, Kassem theorizes as deeply embedded in what he terms mainstream Lebanon, which is a term I want to come back to later, which is this idea that Lebanon is a Christian country, a haven for minorities in the Middle East, where these minorities are oppressed by these, Muslim majority nations, and a country that cleaves more to Europe than the Arab world. This anti-Muslim racism, he argues, is the local expression of what he calls, again, Eurocentric modernity, a modernity cast very much in opposition to backward others. And here, this is the Muslim, the Arab. And under this regime, visibly Muslim women, he argues, are produced as racialized subjects. They're too Arab, too Muslim, and to be distanced from or made invisible. They do not belong to the nation. So I would like to highlight two excellent interventions of Kassem's book, one being more empirical and the other more theoretical. So first, empirically, I think Kassem excels as establishing the fact of the pervasiveness of this anti-Muslim racism. And I think, again, Zina here did a great job about that. And we use very similar terms. I say most poignantly recounted in chapter 4, especially in the workplace. And I want to highlight something that I found really interesting, which is What we might think of this exclusion of hijabis as mediated by class and geography, especially, Kassem's interviewees suggest, for instance, that even in the quote-unquote Islamic milieu of Hezbollah, which Mona, for example, talked about quite extensively, and as well as Laradib, in certain regions, so even in that Islamic milieu, and in certain other regions, that Hezbollah, for example, has not managed to normalize the hijab in most workplaces, is what he argues. He shows that most banks, schools, restaurants, cafes simply do not hire hijab-wearing women, especially not in the front of the house. They can be just in the back, hidden, invisible. Or when they are hired, it's in institutions that self-identify as Muslim, and that also depends also on the nature of their hijab. So what kind of Muslim institution you are, what kind of hijab you wear matters. At the end, the hijabis are very much segregated, pushed into a very narrow space where they are pushed, and I quote, to suffocate in their racialization. So that's what I think is really important to remember, that kind of reality, and not think of it as, oh, this is an incident here, an incident there, that this is really structural. Now, theoretically, in chapter 6, Kassem brings out two discourses defending the hijab. One based on taunting its universality. Oh, Christians also, they cover their heads. Its scientifically proven health benefits, or its emancipatory potential from sexualization of women. The other discourse defends the hijab because as a form as a practice that helps one become a better Muslim, to instill certain virtues like modesty. So the latter analysis echoes strongly with the arguments of somebody like Sabah Mahmoud, as Kassem himself brings out, who argues that for her interlocutors in the mosque movement in Egypt, the headscarf is not simply an expression of piety and virtues, but also one way of disciplining oneself and developing these virtues. One is not just modest and then just, expresses it. You need to continue wearing the veil to kind of develop that and instill these virtues. So such an understanding of the veil is very different, say, it's a kind of detached from the terms of the critiques. So if the critiques are, oh, this is really, it's bad for your health, or this is backwards, or etc., they are kind of what, Kassem calls, they're delinked from these colonial discourses that force women to justify it in these various terms. So in Mahmoud's work and in her interlocutors, these two realms of justification are pitted against one another. So her interlocutors in the mosque movement would say, the veil is only a tool of Muslim self-making. It's a way to live the good life as a Muslim. And they're very critical of any attempt to justify the veil in any other way, whether to say, like, this is our identity, we need to express it, etc. So Mahmoud presents this argument as an alternative, in some ways, to the liberal subject and her conception of agency as freedom. This is a Muslim subject who seeks to submit to norms, to give her agency, and by way of where agency is about actually having tools to endure and persevere. So I think that's what Ali was trying to highlight in terms of a different way completely of thinking about agency that exists in the Islamic tradition. So what I found really interesting here is that in these subjects that Kassem talks to, both these discourses are uttered by the same women. That is a subject that is both Muslim and liberal, if you will. To me, this avoids theoretical arguments that pit Islam as an alternative to the West. So that's what I think is an important theoretical, intervention. But Kassem, however, reaches a different conclusion. He proposes, such was the state of double consciousness, of a wounded self, of a self dwelling in the border of modernity. Again, same quote that Zina brought up. With a deeply wounded habitus, with a deep colonial wound, participants were both deeply colonized and deeply different. So I would like to dwell a little bit on Kassem's theoretical toolbox and how he reaches his conclusion in order to present an alternative reading based on an analytic category that he does not name, even if he introduces it in his introduction, which is tradition. I'm referring here to Talal al-Asad's conceptualization of Islam as a tradition. So I would say that Kassem writes in conversation or in the tradition of some anti-colonial, but especially decolonial thinkers from the global south. So just a joke, he has 18 references to Argentine Walter Mignolo, 10 references to Puerto Rican Ramon Grosfoguel, and 5 references to Martinique Franz Fanon. So we know who he's talking to. For these theorists, as Kassem explains, modernity is not a historical moment, an epoch, what we are living right now, or a condition, including the nation state, global capitalism. You know, that's our condition. We are in the modern kind of, we've always been modern, as somebody once said, that I think. But it is what he calls a Western project of civilization. It is, again, and I quote, a rhetorical narrative conceding coloniality, which he explains is not simply colonialism, but rather the denial and disavowal of all that belongs to the outside of Eurocentric reality. End of quote. So what does this analytic framework reveal, and what does it miss and reproduce? I find that this analytic powerfully renders the way many of Kassem's interlocutors are interpolated by and forced into using the categories of their oppressors. It captures the pain of seeing women feeling they need to justify their existence as muhajjabat, feeling the burden of representing Islam in a good way, always being on the defensive and ready for an insult. I think this is really powerful, it's really important, it's really heartbreaking, I think, as Zina says. But I also think that this analytic produces and assumes Islam and European modernity coloniality as almost hermeneutically sealed. So what do we do of Black US American Muslims who are of the West? What to do with the work of scholars like Black American Sherman Jackson, who argues for the existence of an Islamic secular, or Abdullah Naim, Sudanese, who endorses secularism from an Islamic perspective? Are they simply colonized minds? Which I find very problematic as a term. Instead of thinking of Islam as an ontological alternative to modernity, what if we think of its current iteration as an inherently modern one? The tradition as its concepts have been transformed, sparked by its intersections with different traditions. It's neither a tradition that stands as a monument of radical alterity, delinked, nor one that has become colonized or liberal. While some of its concepts might be inflected with modern assumptions, I would say the goals of the tradition remain oriented toward a very different telos, which is worshiping God at the end. Muslims, that's really what they're here for on earth to do. And however much some concepts are internalized, they're kind of being put to very different uses in the tradition. And so they're very different from those of a liberal state, of a liberal tradition or a modern state, despite their points of intersection and convergence. As someone who thinks of Islam as a tradition and as an anthropologist, so I will have to say, like, I actually felt very much as an anthropologist when I was reading you. I was left longing for thicker descriptions, to be honest, for more fleshed out lives and contexts, for joy and resilience, for more debate and strife internal to the tradition, and because I'm also a historical anthropologist, for more history. So let me illustrate these desires of mine and what they entail in terms of analysis. So regarding thick description, Kassem writes of the hijab-wearing woman as a subject position almost, al-muhajjaba. His analysis and conclusions are often written in the single universal category. Objectified and degraded, I'm quoting him, the visibly Muslim woman is always at risk, unable to participate in the and demands for civil rights, unable to practice in leisure activities, etc. She lives in paralysis, end quote. While highlighting these women's pain and suffering, such description rob them of any existence and agency beyond this pain. We never get a sense of these muhajjabat beyond their hijab, or how their discourses about their hijab are inflected by particular contexts. For example, Uzbana's fear of being perceived as a terrorist have nothing to do with the context of North Lebanon in 2018-2020, of the context of the Syrian Azmeh and the talk of ISIS and terrorists. Now, so this is one regarding thick description. Regarding debate within the tradition, I found there was a remarkable uniformity in the 100 or so muhajjabat discourses that you discuss. For example, while he brings plenty of examples of interlocutors who present the abaya as the only true shari'i option, I did not hear of common arguments that the form of expression of the hijab did not matter, but it was that modesty that mattered, the coverage. Like, where does where does this end, really? Or arguments as those highlighted by Suad Abdul Khabir in Muslim Cool, who, on black Muslim, US Muslim American dandies, who use hadiths like, Allahu jameel yuhib al-jamal, Allah is beautiful and he loves beauty, when Allah yuhib an yura athar ni'matihi ala abdihi. So God likes Muslims showing their blessings, to explain their attentiveness to dress. So this kind of way of dressing is not something that has to be just about consumerism. What happens to these debates within the tradition? I've surely heard them in many Muslim debates in Beirut, as somebody who circulates in such circles. And one wonders why they do not surface in these interviews and focus groups. Could the focus group itself have its own dynamic that might be worth highlighting? I think this is, again, where the anthropologist versus the sociologist comes out. Although we do use, but we like, deep hanging out, as we like to call it. And finally, regarding history, here an important move to take, Kassem does an important move, I think, which is to take his interlocutors' perceptions seriously. He adopts the term, for example, mainstream Lebanon. So I was wondering what was the Arabic term for this, and what kind of reality does it have? Is it true that Lebanon remains predominantly a Christian Western cleaving country? What happens to the fact that this ideal was contested from the very beginning by many, many Muslims and Christians as well, I was also left longing for a history of various Islamic dress in Lebanon. Kassem is aware that the arguments he presents could appear like, and I quote, a call for a practice of a so-called imagined traditional form of the hijab. So I think he's aware of that kind of, this disparaging of modern dress could make it look like, oh, the real true only way that Muslims should dress is actually, with a abaya or a niqab or whatever kind of extreme kind of version we might want to call it. So it's the historization of the discourse of the abaya as the only true shari'i option, which, as I mentioned, is often mentioned, and a thicker description of the authors of this discourse, I think, would have been helpful for us to ground also your interlocutors' own discourses. And I was surprised that there was no discussion of the niqab as a new Salafi import in the last few years, or the chador as an Iranian one, or of the kabut as a perfectly shari'i option, for instance. I think these are historical kind of, kabut, if you think about the Qubaysiyat in Syria, that's kind of their main kind of thing they use. So as I hope these questions show, thinking of Islam as a tradition with attention to context, debate, and history reveals a more complex picture, which to me opens the question I had posed earlier more broadly, and which in fact is something that you ended with, I have to say. So it's in some ways, I think we are on the same page, which is, what are the insights brought by thinking Lebanon through decolonial theory? What does this framework miss? Thank you.
So thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I think I want to start with a quick disclaimer that is that I'm quite distant from the topic of this book, and I don't mean that only in terms of my positionality, but also in terms of the kind of scholarship that my work is rooted in. So I'm not very fluent in the literature on Islamophobia or Islam or women and gender studies for that matter. And so I thought I'd start by explaining my entry point into this. And part of my entry point is that I've been talking to Ali intermittently for the last few years about our work. We've been talking about that, and so he suggested that I read the book and I react to it from my situatedness in social and political psychology, and so and particularly from a Fanonian look into social and political psychology. So that's what I'm going to attempt doing. And so relatedly, one of the striking characteristics of this book that Ali, I'm gonna call you Ali, I'm sorry, I'm just used to it, that Ali reassuringly probed me with before I read the book was that the conceptual labor that the book does moves beyond the specific case of visibly Muslim women in Lebanon, and that is that it deals with the processes of dehumanization and and racialization of what the book calls modernity's others. And so alongside that, there is also a reformulation of or a rereading of identity-based violence in Lebanon outside of the intergroup context. And that said, the book takes very seriously documenting the lived experiences and narratives of visibly Muslim women and situating these narratives within the larger geopolitical and historical context of the Lebanese state and the modern colonial project that has brought that state into existence in its current form. And so I found that there were two narratives that were there was one narrative presented in the book that stood out, but I think it was mostly reverberated in two voices that stood out to me. I'm pretty sure there are so many other voices. But the first voice and the most pertinent one was a voice of the self that is experiencing and narrating a certain mechanism of wounding, or what Ali calls wounding. And within this, the self is testifying to a wound that fluctuates between a violence that is identifiable and nameable and another that isn't. And here the infliction of pain seems to be internalized by the self and in a way transforms the self and transforms the self's relationship with the body. And the body here does not emerge as the flesh, but the body as it is perceived in this context, it's the visibly Muslim body. One layer of this was that the validity of the violence itself and the conversation around the very possibility of anti-Muslim violence to be inflicted in a context that is outside of the West, that is outside of the common way that anti-Muslim violence is imagined, becomes part of that very narrative, as in the very possibility that violence and that wound can be perceived as something that is unreal, that is not possible to have been inflicted. Ultimately, I felt in some of those narratives seeps into the very understanding of the self of the wound and the very reaction to that wound being there because of the questioning that surrounds it. And so I found that the narratives broadly attempt to access that wound through recounting incidents of violence and recounting incidents of violence that have happened in the Lebanese sphere in private and public spaces. And so visibility within that context was very central. And I think you already mentioned that visibility here is not only the visibility of how public the space where the woman is, and then another layer of it is also how visibly Muslim she looks. And within that, the kaleidoscope framework suggests that the more modern she looked, the less Muslim she looked, and hence the treatment or the violence that is inflicted would be inflicted differentially. And so, given that there is sort of a positive correlation proposed between visibility and the extent of the violence that is inflicted. And here I want, this will ultimately lead into a question. And here I want to ask about, it seemed that affective reaction to the wound was at this point changing to a cognitive one, to a cognitive mental map making one, where because the visibility was so central to the wound itself and to the wound's possibility of replicating and of being salient, then there was this engagement with redrawing the map of the country in this case along the potential of harm. And so where the body can be visible and how harmful can the repercussions be. And so this exercise of mapping spatiality depending on one's perceivable identity is definitely not common to visibly Muslim women, and you don't make that argument. And specifically in Lebanon, I think a very common way of, in public discourse, of talking about Lebanon through territorialism is that people consistently need to negotiate their identity based on the space that they're in and the dominant identity that rules that space. And so one element of this is very much structural and material, and then another element is very much cultural. And in the book itself, I think a lot of time is spent on the cultural element of policing and delimiting and constricting the visibly Muslim body. And that delimiting and constricting also happens to other identities, queer folks, migrant workers, refugees, and that is on top of other state-related relations. But within the cultural one, I'm wondering if your definition of the mainstream Lebanese culture, to me, I understood that as a gaze, or it gets operationalized as some sort of a gaze. And within that, I'm wondering if in the imaginary of the visibly Muslim woman, I think you spent a lot of time on what that gaze looks like and who the Lebanese mainstream cultural gaze represents and what it holds. I'm wondering if the visibly Muslim woman interpolates other gazes, as in if there is a transfer of being the recipient of the gaze to being the projector of it within the imaginaries of other groups. And then if yes, then I wonder how that figures within her relationship to the wound that is inflicted on her by someone else's gaze. So yes, and I think this relates back to another voice that is apparent, which is the voice that is attempting to make sense of the wound. Because so within that, I think because you also used Fanon to explain the zone of non-being, and also the whole idea of the gaze. Within the Fanonian discourse, that is very fixed in that the black man does not return the gaze to the white colonizer. So yes, I'm wondering how if you've thought of that and how it would look like. And then the second thing and the only other thing I will say is that I think one of the really cool things about this book, and the reasons why I really, really liked it, is because it makes the decision to not root this in sectarianism, which I've told you before, and you've also mentioned it. I think that one, it's a bold decision, but also it's in social science discourse in general, there is a way of writing and analyzing and theorizing identity-based violence that is almost automatically within the lens of sectarianism. And I think when I first approached the book and I read the title and I judged it by the title, I thought it was still doing sectarianism, but it was interested in one direction of sectarianism, because sectarianism is usually articulated as a bidirectional relationship. So I thought it would be still within the framework of sectarianism for the most part, but interested in the direction from the non-Muslim sects to the Muslim sects. And the book really doesn't do that. The book disrupts the very framework of sectarianism, and it doesn't look for answers for why an anti-Muslim sentiment exists within the borders of Lebanon, which I think a lot of the limitations of sectarianism frameworks sort of falls into. And I'm wondering, because you've already experimented with investigating and thinking through intergroup, what is usually referred to as intergroup prejudice, stereotyping, tensions, conflict, and looking into that outside of the borders of Lebanon and bringing that back to global colonial world orders. Do you have any kind of insights or reflections on how does that translate? How does that exercise of going beyond the borders of the country to explain intergroup or what manifests as intergroup relations beyond the specificity of the topic of Islamophobia and women? Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghina. Ali, you have a very difficult job. Please, I know it's very difficult to answer everything, so I'm sure you're going to navigate your way through.
Can I just take these and go away and just think about them?
Disappear. I mean, yeah. I've been actually thinking that these insights that come at the book talks are so precious that we should find a way for you to publish this collectively, because you all take the time of engaging with these books and writing about them, and it's really an opportunity to do something with it and reflect further. So that's a footnote, seeing a real opportunity there. But of course, Ali, I mean, feel free to engage. I'm sure you'll have other conversations.
Okay. Thank you all three. I mean, I really appreciate that. And like I said, particularly at this time of year, but those were very generous, but also very generative points, axes, interventions, which they need a lot of thinking. I'm not going to try to answer not even many of them, but I think I can point to a few things as how I thought about some of them, or how I think about some of them, and how I didn't think about some of them. So this is based on my PhD, and I think within the scope of that, there were a number of practical and pragmatic decisions that I needed to make that were just, otherwise it was just not going to work or just not going to happen. One of them was who I would include as participants and who I would talk to. And there were multiple stages of it. There were multiple stages of it where I almost quit because I felt it doesn't work. But there were also multiple stages of it where I tried to include other groups, and then we're like, no, that doesn't work. The reasons for that are multiple and complex. For example, the question of including those who practice forms of discrimination, be them institutions or be them individuals, was kind of raised. I didn't do it. I tried, like, very modest attempt and just gave up very quickly. Partly because I didn't want to think of it as there's another who inflicts the racism and then there's a self that's getting racialized. I wanted to delve a bit more in depth into what my participants perceive and to see them as both oppressor and oppressed, both as the racialized and the racializing at the same time, which has a lot of tensions to it, and which can be really problematic in many ways. But it felt it made sense in the narratives they were sharing. There was also a huge practical consideration in the amount of, at the PhD, I did like 89 or 90 interviews or something like that. And they were really long interviews. So some of them were 3 and 4 hour interviews. And I was by training, I'm a sociologist. I was in a sociology department. That was like, my supervisor was like, what are you doing? What are you going to do with this? So it had already started to feel overwhelming, and I wanted to be able to give it the space and the attention that it deserved. But also I wasn't really sure that I would be able to, which links me to the other question about why they opened up to me, or to the extent they did, because I'm sure there was a limit to what they did, and I think that also answers some of the other questions of the things they didn't tell me, they didn't share, and the things they did but I couldn't see, or I couldn't register, and I couldn't analyze, and so on. But there was a component in which, I tried to have conversations with some of them at the beginning and also at the end of the project of, why do you think I'm the right person to do this? I mean, these are not my experiences. And I think it sat at the intersection of they felt comfortable with me as someone who was also perceived as Muslim, and also perceived as someone who'd understand. but also as someone whom they perceive to have the legitimacy of doing this as someone who's an academic or someone who is doing a PhD. So it's like a really serious thing. But also, and I think I mentioned this in the book, there was a significant component of male privilege and internalized patriarchy, what I would argue. And I'll come to my whole internalized stuff in a second, whereby one, people will take you more seriously. In a patriarchal society, if you talk about this, you know, it's not going to be, oh, you're just being emotional, or you're just kind of blowing it out of proportions. But two, so there was a sense of legitimacy, but also there was a sense of capacity, I'm afraid, which I did feel, which I think was very, very problematic, but which was what it was. So why they opened up to me, I think, is a very complicated thing that I'm not sure I can answer. I'm not sure I know. I know they did, and I know that they did aggressively in some places. There were places when I would be like, I would start with a few questions and then I would get like a 50-minute narrative of things. And then I'm like, you know, we've been talking for an hour. I don't want to take any more of your time. They're like, you're not leaving. You know, like I have a lot I want to tell you. So you sit down and I tell you. So there was a sense of, so there was both that agency of I have something to tell you, and that thing of I want this to be told was something many participants said. So there was that sense of agency, but at the same time, there was also that sense of, you know, you can do it. I can't do it. You can do it. And that tension there made me very uncomfortable with the project. And at multiple stages, it was a key thing. It was a key conversation that I had with a lot of people saying, I don't think I should be doing this. I really don't think I should be doing this. And I don't think I can be doing that. And then people would be like, everyone feels like that about their PhD. It's okay. You can. You know, there's no perfect vantage point. You can actually come into it from your particular standpoint and so on. I'm not sure to what extent that did or did not work, but yeah, that's how it mapped out. The question of their agency is a really important one. I hope I alluded to it particularly in the section you referred to, the delinking section. I do think, yes. Yes, I do think there could have been more, but so this also has to do with kind of my theoretical orientation, which always, like I try, and then I always find myself kind of leaping back into very post-structuralist understandings of things where I'm not really sure there's any agency here, which I know is which is something I struggle with, and I'm not sure, like I read things. And as I think shows, like I read their attempts to resist as reproductions of power. And that is not to say that, it's absolutely not to say that, you know, the power is sealed or that there are no possibilities. But I don't think those, I don't know to what extent those possibilities are subject driven, or to what extent they can be examined or analyzed, or whether they have lives of their own that are beyond the subject. That just unfold in ways that I don't think I can capture through this kind of fieldwork, at least. Maybe through more ethnographic fieldwork, perhaps, but not through this. Not as someone with my positionality doing this kind of project. I'm aware of time. So mainstream Lebanon isn't a category that they kind of put forth. I do not want. I hope it didn't come out that way. I do not want to posit it as a category that exists. I want to posit it as a category that exists in their imaginaries, and hence it has lived experiences, it has lived effects, it has material effects, regardless of, you know, whether it's actually out there, whatever that means. So بالعربي it was المجتمع اللبناني, and the reason why I didn't just translate that as Lebanese society, because when I would ask, I mean, what do you mean المجتمع اللبناني? Who is that? And they'd be like, you know, like Nes. I'm like, but that is I had a lot of conversations about trying to nuance that. And a lot of times it would be like, they would specify particular groups, and then they would be like, you know, but you can find this, like everyone has it, my mom has it, I have it. Like, there was that pervasiveness of a sense of an imagined hegemonic identifier of al-mujtama, which was the gaze, like which had that gaze, that very powerful gaze that Ghina mentioned. Okay. Right. So about Islam, I do think of Islam as a discursive tradition. Absolutely. And but I don't think, so given the nature of the project and given the nature of what it was trying to think through and its limitations and what it didn't end up doing, I'm not sure. So I'm not interested in, well, I don't think analytically and conceptually, for me, Islam being the construct it is, and being the specific socio-historical articulation that comes out of a particular discursive tradition, that was not something they had. That was not something they were putting forth. They were putting forth a very essentialist conception of Islam, and they were putting forth a conception of Islam that they claimed they knew and could identify easily. And like, we know what it is and we know what it's not, and it's like clear cut. And that is what I don't think came up sufficiently in the book, is the erasure of that pluriversality and that diversity and that heterogeneity that exists within that discursive tradition. There is so for them there wasn't that, but I would hope that there is. Like, I would hope that Muslims would be able to articulate Islam as a pluri everything tradition, but I guess maybe not. But in the sense of the extent to which they disagreed, I would argue that in relation to their discrimination, because they weren't trying to make an argument about the hijab, right? So it was sort of in the backdrop of my conversations and of my data and of my transcripts, but there wasn't an argument about the Muslimness or non-Muslimness of it, the legitimacy or non-legitimacy of it. What do I need? Do I need it? Do I not need it? And they were actually, even in focus groups, there were of course some disagreements, but even in focus groups, there was that sense of, we are the object of aggression. So I'm not going to fight with you about the legitimacy of your dress. I'm just going to posit like an imagined sort of general overarching thing. And let's not get into the details right now, because that's not the point. We're talking about the common experience. And one thing that I tried to highlight here is that it is the experience that cuts across all of those different forms that they really wanted to talk about. And then, of course, it is a heterogeneous experience. But yeah, I think the conversations in the field, even with participants who were kind of versed or who I knew like attended religious classes or delivered religion classes, they weren't really interested in delving into the theological dimensions of it, or in delving into what does it entail or what does it not entail, which is something that it is worth thinking about and maybe going back to. In relation to Islam's relationship to modernity, that is a very big question that I am still thinking through, and I'm not sure where I stand on that. Sometimes I feel that yes, there are spaces of ontological difference in relation to Eurocentric modernity. Sometimes I feel there aren't, and that is a part of why I'm not super convinced that Latin American decolonial thought is very useful for the region, because I think the ontological difference between indigenous cosmologies and epistemes that inform Latin American decolonial thought are far more removed from Eurocentric modernity coloniality than Muslim tradition. And I think the entwinement between Islam and Europe historically narrows that gap a lot. And that is, that is a huge issue for me in trying to articulate alternative liberatory Islams, because there is a space where it ends up being there is an epistemic space in which it operates and a border to that in a way, even if it's a border that moves, but there is a border, I think. So I don't think that at all, but I do think that they were articulating their Islam as an identity rather than as an episteme, as something that stands as the other of European modernity, as an identity. And that is an issue in the sense of the book sits very uncomfortably across theory and empirical work, and it's trying to theorize through empirical work, which for me lives with that tension, which is not a tension in the sense of something that needs to be resolved, but a tension in something that just needs to sit there.
Ali, just sorry to interrupt, because I'm aware of the time and the fact that the audience might have some questions.
Okay.
So if you can,
okay.
we
I
can
just have like
continue the
6 more
conversation.
pages. Oh.
We
Okay.
can continue the conversation outside, but
Okay.
just to give enough space for you to answer both Nada and Ghina.
Okay. Okay. One last thing is about the al-muhajaba as a single category. I would love to hear more about that, because I tried to explicitly differentiate the muhajaba as a lived experience and as an identity, but I do think there was an overarching identity that they felt they shared, and the formation and the construction of that is something that would be interesting to develop. Yeah, thick description. Again, this just like the book sits uncomfortably across theory and empirical work, I sit uncomfortably across disciplines. So I'm not trained in anthropology. I'm not an anthropologist. It wasn't an ethnography. I wish it was. And sometimes I feel like, you know, is it a fake kind of ethnography? So yeah, the limitations of that, my own training, my own kinds of methodological approaches come out there. And again, the impossibility of me doing an ethnography on this project or on this question. Okay, does Lebanon remain this Western Christian construct? Of course not. And I think there's a very interesting. So the fieldwork for this was done in 2017, I think. So prior to everything that's happened over the past 3 years, and I do think things have changed. And I do think that the way the Lebanese imaginary has changed and has undergone significant changes. And I do think that over the past 15 or 20 years, the place of Islam in Lebanon has definitely changed. And I mean, Mona's the expert on this, and the articulation of Islam in the country across different sects and in between different sects and so on. So there's a lot there, but I think there's a back and forth in the sense of, does this make Islamophobia less prevalent or more prevalent? And I would actually make the argument that with the more recent developments, it's actually making it more prevalent in some spaces at least. That needs fieldwork, that needs maybe a different project. But I think from anecdotal evidence and experiences, I think it might be getting worse. So I think there's an interesting relationship between the rise of Muslim political power and the rise of anti-Muslim racism in the country, which there's something there to think of, well, how do you combat Islamophobia? Well, you get political power, you establish a particular, well, not really, that doesn't work that way. At least it's much more complex than that. And yes, I do think the hijab is a new import, and even more, like, not just in the sense of its forms, in the very idea of the necessity of the hijab as to be Muslim. That is very, very recent. And the fact that my participants did not, I think I mentioned that, I'm not sure if I mentioned that anywhere, but the fact that my participants did not articulate it as something that is very recent was, another indicator of particular other hegemony, which gets me to Ghina's questions. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you were saying. So there are multiple hegemonies, right? And I don't think there's one, this is trying to bring out an axis of power that we don't look at sufficiently, I think. That is absolutely not saying that there are not other axes of power, including contradictory axes of power. And theoretically, I don't think power is, I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it needs to be coherent. I don't think it needs to be to say, I can make sense of all of these different things and how they. I think the state of contradiction, the state of ambivalence, the state of oppositional things coexisting and existing at one and the same time is very possible. And I think that is the case. And so this is not making an argument that, this is what's happening and this is it, and there isn't something else that's happening or something in reverse that's happening. And your point about what is real and what is unreal is really, really powerful. But the visibility of it and the mapping of it comes to that, right? So there are those alternative hegemonies, and there is that sense of, there is that returned gaze, I think. And I think that returned gaze is a separate form of discrimination and a separate form of exclusion and a separate form of aggression that also needs to be thought through. And I would argue it needs to be thought through, not reduced, but thought through in relationship to Islamophobia and where it situates that subject, but definitely not reduced. One last point. Okay, sorry. Okay, I discussed the gaze thing, which I think is very generative in terms of thinking about this. But yeah, so within the imaginaries of other groups, and to not root this in sectarianism, I think there's a tension in the book about groups and about. So I definitely didn't want to think of this in terms of majorities, minorities, not even in terms of identities. To think about this in terms of epistemic positionalities, in terms of understandings of the world, cosmology, and so on, but also to say that these groups and who gets, who belongs to what group is much more complex than we think it is, and in many ways, the book does not discuss that. What happens in reverse, and maybe it should have. I don't know what would have happened to it had it done so, or what needed to be done for it to do so. But I definitely take that on, and yeah, maybe it should have. The point about the borders of Lebanon is, I think, a huge one, and I think Lebanon is again a particular case, right? Not an exceptional one, but a particular one. And what would it mean? So in the book, I try to think through its construction as an imagined, Christian home in the East and so on, and that imaginary, and how it became a hegemonic, and how it survives, and how it's, how it has afterlives within the experiences of participants and within their imaginaries. But how does that map onto other spaces? Because I think analytically. So the last thing I say is, the book is not trying to be explanatory. The book is trying to analyze, to think about issues. But I do not claim, and I don't think I can claim, that it's explaining the phenomenon. I think so. And had it been trying to explain, I think it would have needed to take on a lot more, maybe including speaking to people who exert that form of racism. But this is not an explanatory analysis. And I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much for all of those really, really wonderful interventions.
Thank you, Ali. It reminds me of what you said earlier, that it's a book more on coloniality. And I remember we had a discussion about its title at some point, where you really did not want to put Islamophobia there, but yeah, or visibly. Yeah, so it echoes previous tensions you were feeling prior to the making of the book. I have a few questions, but I will pass on those and give the floor to the audience in case people have questions. Professor Al-Harisi, if you have other hands, we're a few, so we'll pass the mic quickly. Huwaida, please, تفضلي.
Thank you, Mona. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Ali. I'm going to be honest. I was made to feel uncomfortable by some of the arguments because I felt that there was no clear line drawn between perceptions of visibly Muslim women by people who practice discrimination against them, and how they are, on the other hand, addressed and seen from within. I didn't feel that there was any seen from within, that they were kind of lump summed into one singular category and portrayed as these wounded victims and singularized as a reading. And I share Nada's critique that it made me think that there was too much of blurring lines between the perception, the gaze, and having interviewed people, having the empirical part, to see from within. Maybe see them as empowered, maybe see them as political, active feminists wearing hijab, but to try to only see them through the hijab is further discriminating intellectually for them. And I felt that the book, or at least the discussion here today, I mean, even asking a question like, oh, did they really open up to you? And you saying, yes, because of the patriarchal society, they felt I'm more legitimate. I mean, accepting these singular readings that are discriminatory in nature as theoretical frameworks, I found, couldn't feel comfortable, carrying on, not because I'm visibly hijabi, but from an intellectual feminist viewpoint. I mean, if we're celebrating modernity, diversity, and individuality, then why are we not looking at these women as individuals whose hijab is only 1% of who they are, and their own constitution, political alliances, religious practices, womanhood, blah, 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 professional identity. I feel that there should have been a breakthrough, because you're looking from within, to say, despite all these perceptions and practices and gazes, the empirical research shows that it's a different picture, but not to re-endorse and reproduce the stereotype of treating all 90 women, turning them into a subject of this kind of singular. I felt uncomfortable hearing that over and over today through the discussions. The other thing I want to talk about is also, something that Nada raised. I mean, I felt more comfortable after Nada's intervention, to tell you the truth, because I felt that, okay, there is a voice that's saying, Islam itself is not singular. Islam itself is this discursive tradition that's practiced, interpreted. There are many schools of thought within it. It's not a prescription that turns a hijabi woman to a subject that is a wounded. So, I mean, this kind of sequence of singularity made me feel more uncomfortable throughout. So I hope I invite you. I mean, you already commented on Islamophobia and Lebanon. That was my first reaction, is why are we using this colonial construct of Islamophobia within a Eurocentric and Western logic, and inviting it to Lebanon? And then you explained that. So I also was hoping to hear that at the end, a critique of that title in itself, to say, okay, it's not sectarianism, it's not Islamophobia, but in Lebanon there's class issues, there's other issues that force a particular gaze and a particular practice. I mean, I tell my friends, just to add to your empirical research, that I felt more discriminated against as a muhajjaba here in Lebanon than in the US. So yes, there are these practices, but how do we theorize them? From without or from within? And to be very careful if we go to the within, and to really look at these women as, more than just their hijab. Thank you.
Hi, Ali. The question is a bit away from the hijabi woman. It's more of discussing Lebanon. Lebanon is still not clear for me. It's still the definition of Lebanon itself, because this is very debatable. So what did you mean besides mainstream Lebanon? Because you said in the beginning that you're discussing Lebanese Muslim women. So is it an issue of identity? Are we discussing women as an identity in relation to Lebanon, as a Lebanese? Did we interview non-Lebanese women, but living in Lebanon, experiencing the Lebanese life, and how did they define it, if any? And how did you differentiate Eurocentrism from Lebanon again? Because this as well is not clear, because you said several times that Lebanon is considered a Muslim community. This was mentioned several times, and in the Muslim community, but I don't think this is very accurate, in considering that Lebanon is very much different than the rest of the Arab world because of its particularity. So I just want to know this. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ali. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the panelists. That was interesting. So my question is, in terms of the sample, did you consider interviewing Muslim women who do not wear hijab to ask about what they think, if they think hijab is part of Islamic practice, and why they wouldn't wear it, and so on?
Okay, thank you for those. I want to apologize if that made you uncomfortable. I think there are multiple things there, and I totally take on what you were saying. One of them is that the book is not about Muslim women. The book is about coloniality, and it's trying to think coloniality alongside Muslim women and through their experiences. So, and that makes it sit in an uncomfortable place, and I try to explain that in the book, to say that I'm not trying to tell. I am trying to develop a theoretical understanding about coloniality's processes and functionings. I am not trying. I definitely want to visibilize those experiences and those forms of aggression and discrimination, but this is not the story of Muslim women, and not the story of visibly Muslim women. So in the sense, I think that's how I understand the fact that me not reducing them to this, because I'm not talking about them. I'm thinking with them about something else. I'm thinking with them about coloniality. So that is a part of it. Another part of it is that they wanted to center their visible Muslimness. So in interviews, for example, I tried to talk about, well, can we talk about Islam more broadly? So can we talk about prayer? Can we talk about other forms of ritual? Can we talk about other things? And they'd be like, yes, they're important. They're also discriminated, but there's something about visible Muslimness, and there's something about visible Muslim women that exists at the intersection of, patriarchy and other forms of powers of structure that make them specifically salient, aggressed subjects. So that is also why there's that focus. And another big part of why there's that focus is because of my positionality during the project, which I completely feel might make the whole project illegitimate and maybe shouldn't have been done. But I cannot. So the other dimensions of who they are, I hope some of them do come out in the book. It's not a black and, I hope some of them do come out, but of course they're limited. But they're also limited because of what I had, the earlier point about what I did gather and what they did share and what they didn't share, and what the data says and what the data doesn't say. The data, right? So there's that. But so I hope the book, the book itself, and I hope I didn't read them through the lens of victims. That was definitely not the point. The point was reading them through the lens of subjects of aggression, who are doing something about that. But I think this does raise the attention in this work that says, okay, something in terms of what my fieldwork showed, what the data that I had, what they're doing was something that I say theoretically would work against. So I do not believe in modernity. I do not believe in individualization. I do not believe. So those are things I actually want to work against. And you're absolutely right. Those were things that the majority of my participants wanted to work for. And that is exactly why theoretically my positionality says what you're doing is reproducing modernity. And that is not something I would endorse. And hence it puts me in a very awkward relationship to my participants, which I try to grapple with, but I don't know to what extent I do. That says it's really important to visibilize your forms of exclusion and discrimination. My analysis, my theoretical analysis, the kind of the place I come from to make sense of what you're doing, tells me that I think it's dangerous, and I wouldn't understand it in positive terms. Of course, there are many things that many different women are doing, and I'm not trying to reduce that to a singularity of, this is what they're doing as a homogeneous group. Of course not. But within the fieldwork and within participants, and there's something also here about, snowball sampling, about who the group I ended up speaking to was, and so on. But these are things that exist. So I'm not claiming any representation. The book doesn't claim that it represents anything. It claims that it's thinking alongside particular groups of people to understand a particular phenomenon. But yeah, maybe it definitely needed to kind of emphasize a bit more, these and what it's trying to do, but also take more care to not reproduce any of those narratives, or not to shed any light, or to shed them in that light, or not to reduce them into a particular dimension of who they are, because yes, it is like 1% of who they are. There's more to be said there, but just in and about intersectionality, I think the book I hope takes that on seriously. It talks about class a lot. It talks about capitalism a lot. It talks about geography a lot. Well, not a lot. I mean, okay, I take that back. This is the wrong place to say that. It talks about geography a bit and kind of alludes to the possibility of talking about geography a lot. But yeah, so I hope that is there somewhere. But I just want to insist that the only reason that I for myself legitimized this whole project was their insistence that we want you to talk about our hijabiness. We want you to talk about that particular dimension of our experience. We want those to be shared and thought through. Now, what I ended up doing with that, like with my theoretical kind of thing, is something else. But I hope the book does both, and it does what they wanted, and also what I thought through and theoretically where I come from. Yes, some of them. Yes. And some some articles that came out before the book came out. But of course, there is a big limitation to that, is that it's only those who can read academic English who can read it, which were few, and they loved it. But many of them can't read academic English. And I remember having a conversation with Mona, like before signing with IB Tauris, because I had another book contract, another book offer, and there was no possibility of translation. IB Tauris were a bit more invested, and yes, we'll work to get it translated. Unfortunately, they sort of disappeared after I signed. But hopefully it does happen at some point, and it does get translated, and I get to have that conversation, make it more accessible to all of my participants.
We need to conclude.
Okay, very quickly. So Lebanese, yes, absolutely. It's not just citizens. I think there's a sentence in the book that I said this to Ghina earlier, where I say that they're at the bottom of the hierarchy. They're not. I don't think they are. Non-citizens obviously would be, subject to compounded forms of exclusion. Queer people would be subject to compounded forms of exclusion. Many groups, and at the intersection of those. I only interviewed citizens, specifically because I was very cognizant of there are whole other things that come in if I were to interview, the intersectionality would become far more complicated. And because I was interested in analyzing relationships to the Lebanese state, imagined Lebanese community, ideal imagined Lebanese citizen, and all of that, the limiting that to Lebanese citizens was kind of a pragmatic but also conceptual theoretical decision. Muslim majority country, I don't think I think I said, I might have said, but I wanted to say Muslim majority communities, and I meant the communities within, like Muslim majority communities within the country. I don't think Lebanon is a Muslim majority country, and I wouldn't call anywhere a Muslim country. Like I wouldn't call anywhere a Muslim country or a Muslim majority country. But there are like maybe Muslim majority communities, and I don't like. I think there's also a tension about theorizing in terms of national identities and all of that. That is like a separate question there. But yes, I am not saying. I think it's an Arab majority country. Whether it's Muslim, and again, like who is Muslim? What is Muslim? Muslim in what sense? Different scales. Do we mean political? Do we mean cultural? Do we mean economic? Do we mean demographic? What does that mean? There's a lot of complexity there that I don't get to and I just kind of run away from. And no, I did not interview Muslim women I did not interview other Muslim women or Muslim women who do not wear the hijab. Also for pragmatic reasons. One, because I had too much data to deal with, but also because it would have become conceptually, analytically far too complex to finish, because I had funding and it was ending and I needed to write up and finish it. So that is kind of one of the main reasons why I didn't do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all those questions.
يعطيك العافية Ali. I wouldn't like to be in your position. It's a difficult one. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Thank you so much to our panelists for engaging so insightfully with this book. We've learned a lot from your comments, and I think it's a very important conversation we're having. I think it's a new conversation we're having thanks to the book you've written, which of course has its limitations, and you've discussed it really nicely. Ali is one of the very few people I know who finished his PhD in a record time. So it's also that choice of one needing to finish and having to work with the data that you have that would take another conversation on methods and what do you do with that. But I think the value of that book is also having these conversations on these topics that are understudied, underexplored, and underdiscussed. And I guess I think one can also think about the new horizons of sociology. We know anthropology is a very solid discipline in Beirut with a lot of scholars who are defining the field from Lebanon and beyond. I think in sociology we have less sociologists emerging, and I think it's very interesting that you're in conversation with non-sociologists today, and it tells us something about the field and also how you're trying to rethink it from your positionality in conversation with other disciplines. So thanks again for a very insightful conversation. We invite you to some nibbles and drinks just outdoors, so it's easy, and we can continue the conversation. I thank you on behalf of all the Beirut Urban Lab members, Isabella, Maria, Antonia, who's not here, and the co-directors, Huwaida's here today. And thank you very much for being with us. We'll have further conversations outside.
Thank you so much, Mona, and everyone.
Thank you, everyone.